So today I'm going to be taking a look at a new release from the brand Selten. They are currently on Kickstarter for this Moonphase watch here in multiple variations. I think they have some really cool things that they're offering, and it comes in at a pretty good introductory price at the very least. And yeah, let's take a closer look. Of course, the watches were sent to me by the brand. I had hands-on with it for about 2 weeks. I did not get a watch in return for the review, and I'm not in any way having to show the watch review before it is posted, so just keep that in mind. We have a diameter of 39 millimeters, very constrained lug to lug of 45.3, height of just 11.5, and a lug width of 20 millimeters. Some of the general specifications for the watch, we're going to have the Miyota 9015 beating away in here, modified for Selten, of course, to have this Moonphase indicator. We have 50 meters of stated water resistance with a regular push-pull crown. We have what they describe as a domed sapphire crystal here, but it might be very gently domed. Both cases are made out of steel and feature a tantalum moon disc indicator. Lastly, for at least the Aventurine, future retail will be $8.99, and right now it is on Kickstarter for $6.59. For the Mother of Pearl, I believe this is a 100-piece limited edition each for the black and white Mother of Pearl versions. It's going to be a retail of $10.99 if it ends up hitting retail prices, but right now it is on Kickstarter for $7.59. So I think starting off with the Aventurine, just because this is going to be the more standard version available and in continuous production, we of course have the classic Aventurine base dial here, where you get these kind of very deep dark navy blue, almost black tones to the base dial, and then you have these hints of lighter blue, these specks of gold, these specks of white that give it a very cosmic and just, beautiful starry night kind of feel to it. It's a very alive dial, and if you've never seen Aventurine before, it is a pretty awesome dial material because, again, it just feels like it's living, and depending on the light, you're just getting so much, just different feels to the watch. Selten went with what they call a lancet style handset, which I have not really seen before. It's this beautiful, I would say, modified leaf shape that, again, just has more faceting on it. It's very angular, it's nice, it catches the light really well, and just kind of plays around nicely. We do have this beautiful circular brush minutes track along the outboard here. Catches light, I think, in a pretty nice way, adds just a little bit of contrast to what would otherwise be a relatively boring dial because it's just all Aventurine and it's not readable in that kind of configuration. And it's nice to have an Aventurine dial that is, for once, readable, because most of them do use just the full stone, the full Aventurine effect, and you're kind of guesstimating the time the entire time. Whereas with this one, you can very much guesstimate easier, at least. You can obviously tell the time down to the minute because obviously if we were doing to the second, there's no seconds hand, so we can't do that. The only branding here I think is done beautifully and very subtly with just Selten here at 6 o'clock. Outside that, of course, we have the Moonphase disc. You can see the kind of outer disc is done in this brushed just steel, and then the actual cutout for the Moonphase is done in tantalum. So it has this very dark gray, almost gunmetal-y type tone to it. They claim that tantalum can have a somewhat bluish tone to it depending on the light. Personally, I've never seen that, but your mileage may vary. I do think the inclusion of the tantalum is just there for the sake of it. I don't think it was adding much to the design necessarily, and I did like their previous versions of the kind of Moonphase indicator with meteorite. I thought that was more interesting. So personally, I would have liked to see that carry over here and have a kind of through line between the series as well. Taking a closer look at the CNC Guilloché Mother of Pearl pattern, it is a very interesting Guilloché cut with this radiating pattern out from the Moonphase indicator, and the Mother of Pearl I think is just a beautiful, beautiful touch because it adds this subtle pearlescent sheen. You get those very gentle bluish, greenish, pinkish tones to come out every now and then, just here and there. It's not very often, it's not always all the time. It kind of stays in this silver whitish tone most of the time, but obviously you can get a different slab that might react differently, but as it stands, I think it is a beautiful kind of combination of dial techniques because it's not only Guilloché, but it's Guilloché with an extra layer that's adding even more depth, even more beauty, and even more visual interest to the watch that wouldn't have been there otherwise. And besides the dial, the rest of the watch is the same Moonphase indicator, same handset, same finishing technique for the entire rest of the dial. So looking at the watches in more natural-ish light, you can see there are just reflections that are really grabbed by this Aventurine dial version, but thankfully when the reflections aren't going crazy, you get that beautiful sparkle to the Aventurine. It goes almost black, even though technically it's blue, so you get a lot of like beautiful depth and shine to this watch that, of course, is there. Moving on to the Guilloché, this one It does have reflections, but for some reason it's always a little bit more visible. It's probably because this is such a lighter dial. It's kind of shining brighter at you. It looks beautiful in natural light. It looks beautiful in shaded light as well. You see a little bit more of this like mother of pearl situation going on in the shade as you kind of move it around. It just gives this like gentle, pearly, glossy, of course, pearlescent effect to the dial. That is just beautiful, very subtle. At off angles, you can get almost like a grayish white matte tone out of it. At others, you get that guilloché that pops more. So it is a very versatile and interesting dial in the light. The aventurine, of course, still grabbing those reflections nicely, but again, still nice, beautiful tone to the dial. But I just do think this one you're gonna have to battle with reflections just a little bit more on average. But thankfully the hands do pop enough, they're faceted enough where they are visible most times on the dial, rather than being just one-dimensional and flat and being pretty much invisible on the dial. So taking a look at the CNC guilloché under macro, you can now see that mother of pearl base a little bit more. You see the almost subtle cloudy puffiness to it, the subtle pearlescent tones that are now coming out here and there. This is what makes this dial so fun and just so different and honestly just interesting to own, because these are all little tiny hints of color and detail you're not going to get from any other dial or any other watch you own, unless it happens to also be mother of pearl. So I think it's a very interesting use of it. Of course, it will depend on how subtle or how really not subtle your slab of mother of pearl is. But I do think even if you do have a very subtle slab, this super interesting, intricate guilloché pattern kind of makes up for it. It is super different. I think it kind of complements the mother of pearl rather than overshadows it, which is the nice touch. There's really a lot to love, especially when you go down with the loop and look at all these lines and curves and the depth of them. So it is, I think, a really well done dial overall. The cutting is, of course, not going to be as deep as a traditional rose engine, but honestly, at this point, who cares? You're getting it at a great price point, and you're not paying the premium for some man to take even longer to cut the dial. And right there, you can see some of those beautiful, colorful tones coming out. So it is just a really fun way to add a little bit more interest to this dial. Not to say that it wasn't interesting to begin with. And we're only going to take a look at the aventurine for a second, because for some reason my camera and just the way it's reacting with the light is kind of almost casting this glassy tone on the crystal and not really appearing well on camera, but it is still just fun. It's a beautiful way to see how this dial comes together. It really doesn't get any less complicated up close. At the end of the day, what you get is just this beautiful amalgamation of colors, so many things kind of vying for your attention, but not really overshadowing any part in particular. They all look equally stunning, they all grab your attention equally well, and they all look interesting and unique and just fun. I think objectively, you know, I mean, this is just a cool thing to look at and get lost in, because it does change as you move it around and kind of as the dial lives and morphs and becomes its own thing. Going back to the guilloché dial, you can see the handset is finished very well. We do have a kind of three-faceted handset with the one on the side, the other on the side arching down, and one kind of more flat facet on the very top. It is a beautiful hand. It comes into a very fine point, but a rounded point at the very end. You can even see the little ring the hand stands on is kind of bowled in. It has this concave shape to it, which I haven't really seen from a handset before. So it has just this beautiful appearance even as it's just laying on the dial. It has this kind of surprising amount of depth there. They honestly aren't finished too badly, and keep in mind these are prototype watches, so this is going to be slightly worse than the final version. But even then, this is like better QC than some of the more recent watches I've taken a look at. So I can just say, you know, good on Selten, and I can imagine that the final product is going to be very nicely done. I'm super happy with this handset. I think it looks fantastic on the watch. This second track is done in a really nice pattern. You can see the ink has a little bit of three-dimensionality to it. It kind of goes away once you get to the actual minute markers themselves. I'm hoping in the production versions they add a little bit more depth to that. I'm sure this is just kind of like a dirty, quick version of what will be the final product. But even then, it's not bad as it stands. It still has this beautiful kind of change in color from this more steel gray to kind of almost bronzy copper tone that I think just complements the watch, adds a nice little color depth that wouldn't be there otherwise, And again, a nice way to integrate the brand naming here. Moving the hand so we can just take a closer look at the Moonphase indicator. Again, the base background is just done in this circular brushed steel. When it's not showing the Moonphase, I think this is just a very nice standard good finish to be showing onto the watch. It complements the Moonphase well, and it also is very neutral for any of the dials. When you start to get this tantalum portion in there, again, to me, it's not really anything to write home about necessarily. It just kind of is. It's not really adding much show-stopping to the dial. I do think, again, if they had gone with the meteorite, it would have been at least more visually interesting, or for something like this, they went with another mother of pearl slab. I think that would have been very cool. Or mother of pearl for all of them would have been kind of fun. Tantalum is a little bit more of like a, ooh, look, they're using it, rather than something that is really adding much to the overall presentation of the watch. But overall, I'm very happy with what I see under macro. I think especially something like this Guilloché dial is very beautifully done. Of course, we're going to have little imperfections and specs here because it's a QC kind of rushed dial for it being a prototype, but even then, any of these tiny little marks aren't really bad, so I can only imagine the production versions will be very nice under macro. So taking a look at the case shape, and I think it is deceivingly simple. There is actually a lot of detail going on here. From the top view, we have vertical brushing on the top of the lugs with a little bit of englage just on the kind of lug itself. The lugs have this kind of detached styling where they're almost welded on separately from the case itself. Even at some angles, you can see how the lug kind of juts out from the case just very slightly. Even though we don't have a true continuation of the englage from the lug into the bezel here, right before the bezel starts to turn in and go into a more concave shape, you do have this just flat, standard, straight up portion of the bezel here, which kind of almost, in a sense, continues that englage along the entire case, or at least that idea of polish that your eye can follow. Looking at this bezel, of course, like I mentioned, we do have this beautiful concave shape to it. I just like the way that that bends the light. It's just more visually interesting than most things. It does tend to usually cut off a little bit of visual heft off the watch as well, which is always just nice to see. And it's not something we see super often, so I like when it is used. When we get to the very top, we do have a very slight flat portion to the top of the bezel where it meets the glass basically. So that adds another kind of just angle where the light catches the case, where the light draws your eye into the facet of the crystal and then draws your eye in later to the dial. So it is a really well done bezel. It just kind of does its job of complementing the watch while being interesting in itself. The sides of the case, really not a thick profile overall, but it's also not doing super much to kind of hide its height other than the concave in the bezel. We actually do have a little bit of that same concave shape to the case back as well, which is cool to see. We do have standard horizontal brushing for the bracelet here, which is followed into the links of the bracelet. The tops of the links have that same vertical brushing, but we do have high polish interlinks, and they are also raised in the mid links. It's nice to see an H-style done in a kind of like less sporty context, giving that little raise to it and just a little bit of polish flair that wouldn't always be there. The mid links have this beautiful kind of almost button shape to it, I guess I could describe it as. You do have a beautiful rounded top portion that is completely square, and on each side you have like a little facet cutting down and just catching the light in a nice way. Going to the clasp, we have a classic butterfly deployant clasp. You can see we have a kind of hidden clasp styling. The Selten logo is that mid-link, and I think it just looks nice. It is integrated well. I'm not a huge fan of butterfly clasps, but they said they went for it because it is a little bit lighter and a little bit more lower profile than traditional clasps. The watch does use push pins throughout the bracelet, and then just to note, this watch doesn't fit me perfectly because it's either too loose or too tight. All the links are the same size, but Selten mentioned they will have 1.5 links when the watches are in full production. We do have quick release spring bars here, which is always nice to see. Makes the strap changing super easy here. Again, a little bit of that concave shape to the bezel. Some general text along the outside here, Selten, 50 meters water resistant, automatic, sapphire crystal, kind of just the standard stuff. You can of course see the Miyota 9015 through the display case back. It's usually not a crazy movement to look at. It's just relatively thin. It has a nice striping to the movement in general. It's cool to see that they went with this customized 3-pointed star Selten logo rotor, and it is a very large rotor, not something you're used to kind of seeing. It's nice to see this styling, which has a little bit of skeletonization to see through the movement, and I really like how they kept the striping through the rotor as well. I think it's a really nice touch. Moving on to how this watch wears, we will start with the aventurine. Earlier I was wearing my Visitor Dune Shore here, and just keep in mind this is a 44. before, so this will look a lot smaller. So there we have the Selten sitting on my 6.5-inch wrist. I will say one thing maybe I'm not in love with on the aventurine dial is the hands can go very black at some angles. It is nice because they're faceted, so you can get it into a light that makes it more visible, but I do think it would have been more legible if on the darker dials they maybe did a brushing on the very top layer. I understand that's a more customizable thing, so you're not using the same handset between each exact series and it's harder to do, probably more expensive to do, but it is just an idea to maybe make the watch a little bit more legible on a darker background. Other than that, it is very comfortable on wrist. It doesn't rise up off the wrist too high. I do think this variation looks pretty good on the supplied bracelet, whereas I don't like the Guilloché as much, which I'll show you in a second. For some reason, it just doesn't do it for me. It might just be personal preference. I do think this looks really good on straps though, so keep that in mind. I do think some variations work better on the bracelet than others. Looking at it from the side view, you can see they did a very conforming case shape. There's a little bit of turn down, but realistically the case back isn't that tall. The watch itself isn't that tall in general. So it does just wear very nicely on the wrist overall. It's a short lug to lug, it's not a huge diameter. You have a little bit of this track cutting away from the actual dial itself, so it actually visually appears even smaller than you would expect it to. So it is just a really nice wearing watch. It's comfortable overall. One thing I did not mention, the crown I think is a really good size here. It has this almost like modified buttercup onion type shape. There is a little bit of a gap between the crown itself and the case, which I think is a little bit odd, and I do think that could be made into maybe a screw down function to take that away or something, but as it stands, it's a little strange. It is easy to grasp though, so you know, double-edged sword, it kind of looks a little bit odd, but functionally it is good. First position, this is obviously just changing the moon phase. Click it off to the second, you're now changing the time. The moon changes throughout the day and basically clicks over at midnight. The bracelet is also very comfortable, no sharp edges or odd machining here. You can see the light plays off the bracelet very evenly and disperses pretty nicely. There really isn't a lot of complaints that I have here, other than if aesthetically you just don't like the match of the bracelet. So here is the strap that the Selten comes with. These are made by a very good company that I trust called Has No Bounds, which I've featured many times on the channel before. These are supremely comfortable. You can tell it's specifically made for Selten, for the brand. You can see they have these curved spring bars, which I'm not a huge fan of. Might as well just go straight. It's like, it's curved, but there is still a gap anyway, so it's like, why'd you even curve it? Digressing, it can work, especially if you have a thicker curved lug end. It will integrate and slot in there very nicely, but as it stands, it's a very thin and kind of unpadded, not too thick at the end strap, so this I think would actually work better in a straight end variation. Taking a look at the strap on wrist though, I think it actually looks pretty decent. Again, you still do have a gap even though it's a curved lug bar, so to me it kind of defeats the purpose. But because you have this perfectly rounded soft case shape, and probably because of this cutaway to the bezel, for some reason the rounded spring bar looks good visually in my opinion with the watch, whereas with most watches it kind of doesn't look too right. It is a comfortable strap. I really like the straps that this brand does. And here we have it on the aventurine, super clean, nice little, I mean, it's not black on black because the aventurine is technically blue, but you get the idea. Again, I think both of these look a lot better off bracelet than they do on, and it's just, it is a classier watch. I don't think it's technically meant to be on bracelet overall, and it does pair well on the included strap, which is always rare to see. I think these straps go for about $65, $70 if you bought them separately, so I mean, it's a pretty good value to come with the watch overall. Trying on some different straps, we have this beautiful houndstooth pattern from, I believe it's called Strap Bandits. I'll have it linked down below. I think it's cool, adds a little bit of texture while not going overboard, and kind of a color neutral grayish black. I like it. I think it pulls out of basically every tone you find in this Moonphase indicator, and thankfully not so loud of a pattern that it overshadows the aventurine, which to be fair is kind of hard to do. What's interesting about the mother of pearl is you do have these kind of like defined sections that create these like little rings across the dial, and those are kind of the pattern you see the most. And as you like try to shift your wrist around, you do see some more things come out. Those kind of half circles are always there and kind of in view. We have what I believe is, I think, called like stone kudu leather or something like that, or sorry, stone swift leather. This is made by Keepiece. They don't currently have this on their website, but they do a lot of custom order stuff. So I believe if you just, you know, send them a picture of this, they can have it ordered in or had it made. But I think this pairs really well, especially because it brings out this more cementy, coppery tone out of that little second strap there. I especially think with this mother of pearl, you kind of just want to let the dial shine and do most of the talking. So unless you're trying to complement specifically one of the tones you find in the mother of pearl, or just be crazy and you want to have a loud strap and a loud dial, I think kind of more subtle complementary colors and subtle patterns are the way to go. And because this watch dial is technically blue aventurine, here we have a beautiful blue distressed Italian leather from Vario, playing off those darker blue tones on the dial, but because you have those tiny little hints of lighter blue throughout, I think it still pairs very well and pulls those tones out a little bit. Super comfy combo, really nice way to dress down the watch just a slight bit, and a fun way to add a little bit of color while not being too crazy. And lastly, of course, white silicone, you can't go wrong. Make some of those brighter, little whiter tones on the dial stand out a little bit more. It is just a fun and easy to wear combo. Definitely not a bad combo for the watch overall. If you want to try to white it all out, you can, but it's not a perfect color match. This is definitely more of a silverish, I mean, obviously pearl leaning dial, so you're not gonna be able to find a rubber strap that fits perfectly. So pros and cons of this guy here, and I think one of the biggest pros will be the fact that we're using a lot of unique dials here. I love to see the fact that they're using this Musou, I don't really quite know how you say it, the Musou black paint. It's really cool because it gives that very Vanta black feel that Moser uses. It's pretty much as close as you can get without spending too much money. And I think it's just a really good application of that material. You get meteorite, which is always fun. You get aventurine, you get this CNC Guilloché mother of pearl, which is pretty awesome. And there's undoubtedly something you can find that probably fits your taste. My next pro is that they did a really good job with the case refinement, especially compared to the previous series. It's not the exact same case shape, but they've definitely thinned it out. They've made it more elegant. They've added a lot more unique finishing to the case. It fits very nicely because they made it sub 40 millimeters. It's pretty short lug to lug. It just is a very nicely refined case. And there's really just genuinely a lot to love about what they've done with the case shape in itself, taking the rest of the watch outside of it. My last big pro for the watch is I do just think they did the details really well here. Again, the case shape, the fact that we have this concave bezel, even the concave case back, the fact that you have this beautiful multifaceted Lancet style handset, the fact that you even get the beautiful has no bound strap in the box, which is super good value and a strap that not only can you use on other watches, but it's also an awesome strap just to have included with this watch. The rotor is done very well. All the variations of the watch feel very unique to each other. There's just a lot to love here, and I think they did a really good job with this release overall. Now moving on to cons, and one of my bigger cons, especially what I've noticed on the Aventurine model in specific, is there will be reflections to it that, in my opinion, get in the way of the enjoyment of the dial. I do think, I can't speak from experience because I didn't have the Musou black one here, but because that one, its kind of claim to fame is it tracks so much light, I don't think you're going to get as much light bouncing off the dial and reflecting back up into the crystal, so that one will probably be better with reflections. But with the Aventurine at least, sometimes it's just too reflecty, it's not really cool. To be fair, almost all watches do that, but I really don't think you can get around it unless you add AR to the top, and then you're dealing with the issue of like, are you wanting to add a softer material to sapphire and then be able to scratch the sapphire because you're scratching the AR coating. It's a double-edged sword. There's no perfect way to do it. I do think the lighter dials are kind of the way to go because of that. They don't have as much problem with reflections and they kind of look good in most lighting situations. Another con I have with the watch is I don't really think the tantalum is adding anything to the watch. It's not a lot of the material being used. It doesn't look overly interesting in my opinion, at least visually. Again, like I mentioned, I think the fact that I think it's called the 00 series, has meteorite on their day-night indicator for that previous watch. I think having this watch with a meteorite moon would have tied in, given the through line between the two series, just looked more visually interesting and gone with each of the different dial variations they went for. Even if you don't want to do that, mother of pearl, aventurine for the moon if possible. Like, I think honestly any other material other than what they went with would have been more interesting. It's more of just like a catch buzzword than something that really makes the watch and is like something that you would get the watch for. And lastly, I'm not a huge fan of the bracelet. This is a dressier leaning watch, and I don't feel like the H-Link style is that dressy. I do think they could have gone with something else here. I'm not a big fan of butterfly deployance. That's personal preference. It's finished fairly well. It's just not my style, not my cup of tea, and I think the watch looks better on straps anyway. So final thoughts here, and honestly, between all the series, I think if you want to go super minimalist, Musou Black's probably the way to go, or if you want something that's not going to be like everything else, Guilloché is the way to go. The other variations are very cool, but I do think you're starting to get into a price point where you do have a lot of other options, albeit not a lot of dressy options. If you're comparing this to something like a Baltic, this has a better and more interesting case shape than a Baltic does, 100%. I have here the new Manuine Baltic that's around the same price point and slightly more expensive than most of these Selten variations. And this case shape is not as interesting. It's thin, but it doesn't wear as well, arguably. It doesn't look as visually nice on the wrist as the Selten does. Compared to other things in its price point, this is a good watch. It's holding good value. I do think it's visually very interesting. What I really like is between the initial series that Selten came out with and this one, you see a ton of improvement. You can tell they're paying more attention to details, they're refining a lot more, and it looks honestly just like a much better put together watch. I can't really think of a super affordable Moonphase that's not like an Orient Sun and Moon or something like that. There's like things that Frederic Constant makes, but those are kind of over $1,000 as well. So I think this does offer pretty unique value overall, especially when you're considering the Kickstarter pricing. This one comes in at $759, the other one's at $659. You're getting a lot of watch for that money. I very much look forward to what Selten does in the future. I think this release is absolutely a step in the right direction for the brand. I'm excited to see what they do in the future. I'm excited to see how well this one does, because as of recording this, I think off the top of my head, their goal was like 40,000 or something, and they're already at 130,000 on the Kickstarter. So, I mean, decently well. They're doing decently well. So, if you're interested in this watch, I would absolutely say jump on the Kickstarter. The prices that are going for right now are pretty good for what you're getting, and yeah, I don't think you'll be disappointed. But yeah, anyway, those are just my thoughts. Let me know what you think down below. If you have any questions, let me know. And yeah, thank you as always for watching the video. Hope you got something out of it, and I will see you in another one.